November 3rd, 1918. Meuse-Argonne Forest, France. Captain Jake Thornton crouched in the trench, checking the cylinder of his .45 Colt single-action Army revolver. The weapon was his personal sidearm, carried from Texas when he shipped out with the 36th Infantry Division. Army regulations allowed officers to carry personal weapons, and Thornton had served 10 years as a Texas Ranger before the war. The heavy revolver felt more natural in his hand than the standard-issue Colt M1911 automatic. In 5 days, the war would end with the armistice. But tonight, Thornton's company had orders to raid German positions across no man's land, capture prisoners for intelligence, and disrupt enemy preparations. The mission would be close, brutal, and fought in darkness, where the .45 Colt's stopping power mattered more than magazine capacity. Thornton had 12 other Texans in his raiding party, 5 of them former Rangers or lawmen who carried similar revolvers. The Germans were about to experience frontier justice, delivered at close range in a French forest. The story of how Texas Rangers and their iconic .45 Colt revolvers shocked German forces in World War I reveals an unexpected intersection of American frontier tradition and modern industrial warfare. While the U.S. Army equipped soldiers with modern automatic pistols and bolt-action rifles, some Texas officers brought personal weapons that had served them in law enforcement and frontier conflicts. These heavy-caliber revolvers, designed for stopping threats with single shots, proved devastatingly effective in the confined spaces of trench warfare, where split-second reactions and absolute reliability mattered more than rapid-fire capability. German soldiers encountered these weapons during trench raids and close combat, discovering that American frontier experience translated surprisingly well to the Western Front's brutal intimacy. To understand why .45 Colt revolvers were effective in trench warfare, one must first comprehend the nature of close combat on the Western Front. Trench raids were nighttime operations where small groups infiltrated enemy trenches to capture prisoners, gather intelligence, or simply terrorize the enemy. The fighting occurred at arm's length in darkness, with participants using knives, clubs, pistols, and grenades. Hesitation meant death. Weapons needed to be absolutely reliable, powerful enough to stop an enemy instantly, and simple enough to operate under extreme stress. The .45 Colt single-action Army revolver, introduced in 1873 and carried by Texas Rangers for decades, met these requirements perfectly. The single-action Army was a 6-shot revolver chambered in .45 Colt, a cartridge that fired a 250-grain lead bullet at approximately 900 feet per second. The heavy, slow-moving bullet created massive temporary wound cavities and reliably stopped human targets with single torso hits. The revolver's single-action mechanism required manually cocking the hammer before each shot, which sounds slow compared to semi-automatic pistols. But in practice, trained shooters could fire aimed shots as quickly as needed for close-range combat. More importantly, the revolver had no magazines to fail, no feeding mechanisms to jam, and functioned reliably even when covered in mud, blood, or trench filth. For men who had fought outlaws, rustlers, and border raiders in Texas, the weapon was as familiar as their own hands. Captain Thornton's raiding party assembled after midnight. In addition to their revolvers, each man carried grenades, trench knives, and blackened faces to reduce visibility. Thornton briefed them on the objective. German positions were 200 yards across no man's land. Intelligence suggested a reinforced company held the trench line, approximately 150 men. The raiding party would cross in darkness, breach the wire, enter the trenches, capture prisoners, and withdraw before German reinforcements arrived. Speed, violence, and shock would compensate for being outnumbered. The .45 Colts would be their primary weapons once inside the trenches where rifles were too long and unwieldy. At 0200 hours, the raiders climbed out of their trench and began crawling across no man's land. The ground was cratered from artillery, slick with mud, and littered with debris from months of fighting. They moved slowly, freezing when flares illuminated the landscape, crawling forward during darkness. It took 40 minutes to cross 200 yards. At the German wire, they cut paths through with wire cutters, moving section by section until gaps large enough for men to pass were opened. Then they waited, listening for any sign of detection. Hearing none, Thornton signaled and the raiders slipped through. The German trench was quiet. Sentries were posted every 50 yards, but most garrison troops slept in dugouts carved into the trench walls. Thornton and 2 rangers moved silently along the trench floor, revolvers drawn. They rounded a corner and encountered a German sentry, a young private smoking a cigarette. The German's eyes widened as he saw the raiders, but before he could raise his rifle, Thornton fired. The .45 Colt roared, the muzzle flash temporarily blinding in the darkness. The bullet struck the German in the chest, and he dropped instantly, killed before he hit the ground. The sound of the shot ended stealth. German soldiers began emerging from dugouts, grabbing weapons and shouting warnings. What followed was close-quarters chaos. The raiders charged down the trench, throwing grenades into dugouts and shooting any German who appeared armed. Thornton's revolver fired methodically, each shot dropping an enemy. The heavy bullets at close range were devastating, often throwing targets backward from the impact. Unlike smaller caliber weapons that might require multiple hits to stop a determined opponent, the .45 Colt ended fights with single shots. This was critical in the confined space where enemies appeared suddenly from around corners or through dugout entrances. Sergeant Bill Mackenzie, another former ranger, fought alongside Thornton. Mackenzie had carried his Colt SAA during manhunts across West Texas and knew the weapon's capabilities intimately. When 3 German soldiers rushed him from a connecting trench, Mackenzie fired 3 times in rapid succession, cocking and firing with practiced efficiency. All 3 Germans fell within 10 feet. The revolver's reliability in mud and debris that would have jammed many automatics kept Mackenzie in the fight when a modern pistol might have failed. The German defenders recovered from initial shock and began organized resistance. Thornton's raiders found themselves fighting in both directions as Germans counterattacked from deeper in the trench system. Corporal James Wilson, a 3rd Texan, exhausted his revolver's 6 rounds and performed a combat reload while crouched behind a traverse. The process was slower than changing a magazine, but Wilson had practiced this hundreds of times. He ejected spent casings, reloaded from cartridge loops on his belt, and was back in action within 15 seconds. His first shot from the reloaded revolver hit a German officer who was organizing the counterattack, and the leaderless Germans fell back in confusion. The raiders' mission was to capture prisoners, not hold the trench. Thornton grabbed a terrified German private who had surrendered and signaled withdrawal. The raiders fought their way back to their breach point, dragging 3 prisoners and carrying 2 wounded Americans. German reinforcements were arriving, and staying longer would mean annihilation. The raiders climbed out of the trench and ran across no man's land, German bullets snapping overhead. They tumbled into American lines just as German artillery began pounding the no man's land they had just crossed. The raid had lasted 17 minutes. The raiders suffered 2 dead and 4 wounded, but brought back 3 prisoners and valuable intelligence about German defensive positions. More significantly, they had demonstrated that American close-quarter combat tactics and weapons were effective against German troops who had years of trench warfare experience. The German prisoners, interrogated by intelligence officers, expressed shock at the American raiders' aggressiveness and the devastating power of their pistols. One German sergeant reported that Americans had been firing enormous revolvers that sounded like cannons and dropped men with single shots. He said German soldiers hit by these weapons had no chance of survival, unlike wounds from smaller caliber weapons that men might survive long enough to receive medical treatment. Reports of the raid circulated through both American and German lines. American commanders noted the effectiveness of the .45 Colt revolvers in close combat, and began encouraging other officers from the West to carry similar weapons if available. German intelligence officers noted that American raiders were using unusually powerful pistols and warned troops to exercise caution when facing American close assault teams. The psychological impact of the revolvers exceeded their mechanical advantages. German soldiers who survived encounters with the big Colts spread stories about American cowboys who shot like they were back in the Wild West, creating a mystique around Texas soldiers that affected German morale. The effectiveness of the .45 Colt in trench fighting was not unique to one raid. Throughout 1918, as American forces gained combat experience, Texas soldiers who carried personal revolvers found opportunities to use them effectively. The weapon's reliability in adverse conditions made them valuable when standard-issue automatics jammed from mud and debris. The heavy bullet's stopping power prevented wounded enemies from continuing to fight, which was critical when fighting at close range against determined opponents. The revolver's simplicity meant that malfunctions were rare and could usually be cleared quickly by the shooter without specialized tools or training. The contrast with the 1911 automatic pistol is instructive. The 1911 was an excellent weapon, reliable by automatic pistol standards, and chambered in the powerful .45 ACP cartridge. But automatics are inherently more complex than revolvers and more susceptible to malfunctions when dirty. The 1911's magazine could be damaged, its ammunition could be contaminated, and its feeding mechanism could jam if not properly maintained. In the filth of trench warfare, maintenance was difficult, and conditions were optimal for weapon failures. Revolvers, with their simple mechanical action and sealed chambers, functioned reliably even when caked in mud. The shooting technique required for single-action revolvers also proved advantageous in some situations. The deliberate process of cocking the hammer before each shot enforced fire discipline and accurate aiming. In the stress and confusion of close combat, shooters with automatics often fired rapidly without aiming, wasting ammunition and missing targets. Revolver shooters, forced to cock between shots, were more likely to aim each shot deliberately. At ranges under 20 feet where most trench fighting occurred, this accuracy mattered more than volume of fire. The psychological effect of the revolver's report and recoil also contributed to its impact. The .45 Colt, in a steel-framed revolver, produced significant muzzle blast and a distinctive deep boom that was louder than most military pistols. In the confines of a trench at night, this sound was intimidating and disorienting. Enemies hearing the distinctive report often hesitated or flinched, giving the shooter a psychological advantage. The visible muzzle flash, while a tactical disadvantage in some situations, also served to blind and startle opponents in close quarters. The historical precedent of rangers using these revolvers against human opponents in life-or-death situations provided training that formal military instruction could not replicate. Rangers had learned through experience when to shoot, how to shoot under stress, and how to maintain effectiveness after having killed. This psychological conditioning proved valuable in combat. Many young soldiers froze or hesitated the first time they faced lethal force. Rangers who had already experienced gunfights were less likely to hesitate, giving them a critical advantage in close-quarters encounters where split-second decisions determined survival. The post-war analysis by military historians noted that while the .45 Colt revolvers were effective in specific circumstances, they were not superior to modern weapons for general military use. The revolver's limited capacity, slow reload time, and requirement for strong hands to operate made it unsuitable as a standard-issue weapon. But for specific roles, particularly close-quarters combat by experienced shooters, the old frontier weapon proved it still had value in modern warfare. This lesson would be forgotten and relearned in later conflicts when soldiers again discovered that reliability and stopping power sometimes matter more than capacity and rate of fire. Captain Thornton survived the war and returned to Texas, where he resumed work as a ranger. His .45 Colt, carried through the Meuse-Argonne campaign and multiple trench raids, was retired to his personal collection. He would later write in his memoirs that the revolver had saved his life multiple times in France, just as it had in Texas. The weapon's reliability when covered in mud, its stopping power against determined opponents, and his familiarity with it from years of use made it his preferred weapon despite having access to modern alternatives. Other Rangers and Texas soldiers who carried similar weapons reported similar experiences, creating a legacy of the .45 Colt's effectiveness that influenced American military small arms doctrine for decades. The Germans' shock at encountering these weapons in close combat reflected their unfamiliarity with American frontier weapons and the men who carried them. German soldiers were accustomed to standardized military equipment and tactics. The idea that enemy officers would carry antique civilian weapons into battle seemed primitive and foolish. But the Rangers understood that tools matter less than the skill and determination of those who use them. A powerful, reliable revolver in the hands of an experienced fighter was more dangerous than a modern automatic in the hands of a novice. The Germans learned this lesson in French trenches, where Texas Rangers delivered frontier justice with .45 Colt revolvers. Shocking professional soldiers with weapons and tactics from America's frontier past applied to modern warfare's brutal close combat. The old Colt proved that some designs are timeless, that frontier experience translated to modern warfare, and that sometimes the old ways remain effective against new threats.